Okay, great. We'll go ahead and get started. Sorry for the delay, everybody. So we will start our panel on Towards a Fossil-Free Future, Governance Challenges and Opportunities for Leaving Fossil Fuels Underground.
Clara, shall I go? My audio didn't work now, but I can take over if you want.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks.
Sorry for that. I don't know, after the hiccups, but now it works. Okay, so good day, everyone. Very sorry for the hiccups. Welcome to our session Towards a Fossil-Free Future, Governance Challenges and Opportunities for Leaving Fossil Fuels Underground. Thank you all for joining us today. So my name is Nina, and I will briefly introduce our panel and then run you through a few logistics. So we have 1.5 hours together with the last 30 minutes reserved for Q&A. Please note, well, I think everyone is familiar to Zoom. You will be muted throughout the session, but feel free to type your questions into the chat box. And yeah, as they come into your mind, and we gather them and we'll address them in the Q&A session after our presentations. During the Q&A, feel free also to use the raise your hand function if you wish to ask your question verbally. And you can also continue submitting your question in the chat and we will address them as they come in. Also, if you ask your question, kindly introduce yourself. I think that will help us all to get to know each other a little bit better. And yeah, let's now move on to the agenda and our speakers. We will start our session with a brief presentation by Clara McDonald, Frank de Moray, Augusto Heras, and myself. We are all PhD candidates affiliated with the CLIF Research Project at the University of Amsterdam, and today's session is dedicated to exploring governance challenges and opportunities for key stakeholders in the global energy transition. Following our presentation, our colleague Dr. Yang Chen and Principal Investigator Joyita Gupta of the CLIF team will introduce an exciting tool developed by Yang, the CLIFIA. It's an interactive atlas for climate change and fossil fuels, offering a comprehensive mapping of, among other global data on fossil fuel-related emissions, resources, reserves, and we will hear a lot more about that later. Afterwards, Dr. Mathieu Blondel, Assistant Professor at the Vrije University of Amsterdam, will present his work on upstream asset divestment among international oil companies in the post-Paris era. And lastly, we will hear from Dr. Ximing Yang, Assistant Professor at Leiden University, and she will discuss the emergence of mixed donor organizations as clubs in climate finance. We are looking forward to your participation, and yeah, without further ado, let's get started. Okay, as briefly mentioned in the introduction, my colleagues and I are part of a research project which is called CLIF, Climate Change and Fossil Fuels, which focuses on the role of big investors in leaving fossil fuels underground. And we do that by looking at different relevant actor groups. And today, four of us will be presenting key findings from our research, each focusing on governance challenges and opportunities for these major stakeholders to accelerate the phasing out of fossil fuels. And our aim is to shed light on the dynamics and decision-making processes that can either support or hinder a more sustainable energy future. And to kick things off, I'll hand over to my colleague, Clara, who will be talking about pension funds. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So I will just briefly introduce you to my research on pension funds and the potential role they can play in phasing out fossil fuels. Next slide. So I will start briefly by outlining why we should care about pension funds. There's a lot of expectations that pension funds are important and relevant actors in the energy transition. This is because they're massive asset owners. We know they're highly invested in fossil fuels, many of them at least. They have a long-term investment horizon. So theoretically, they have an interest in the long-term, protecting the long-term value of their investments. And they have been kind of at the forefront of climate commitments from investors. However, despite this kind of optimistic role that pension funds could be playing in the energy transition, in reality, we see a different picture. They have a very mixed voting record at annual general meetings for shareholders at fossil fuel companies, sometimes voting for climate resolutions, sometimes against them. While they have gotten certain wins from fossil fuel companies, so convincing fossil fuel companies to set net zero targets, for example, those same companies have since, many of them at least, have gone back on their commitments and kind of committed to increasing their production in recent years since setting that net zero goal, which has led to certain pension funds expressing pessimism in the ability for them to actually be able to change fossil fuel companies. And the reason for this kind of discrepancy between what pension funds should be able to do and what we can actually see them doing is often explained as a mismatch in terms of the incentives and the mandates that pension funds have with more ambitious climate action. So to try to explore that a little bit more and understand the room that pension funds have to be able to act on climate, I looked further into the institutional architecture shaping pension funds, asking what governance structures shape their climate strategies across three main areas: climate governance, pension governance, and sustainable finance. So some of my research, recent research has been looking further into this, focusing on the US, the UK, and the Netherlands as three of the largest pension markets, and looking at policy and regulation, as well as more kind of normative institutions shaping pension climate strategies like voluntary investor initiatives. I don't have time to go through all of the findings from this, but I will just point out some of the key highlights for this conversation. So first, while there's a large degree of fragmentation between climate and pension regulation in terms of the institutions in charge, the actors involved, and the actual content of the regulation, we do see that sustainable finance can go some way to bridge the gap between these two. Some of the most ambitious climate action is coming from voluntary investor initiatives, and also the most ambitious action on fossil fuels specifically comes from these initiatives, specifically the net zero frameworks. However, there is a key limitation to these as a form of regulation, and that is that they are almost completely voluntary and disclosure-based. So even the more mandatory regulation on sustainable finance is generally focused around disclosure rather than around dictating any particular type of policy. On fossil fuels specifically, within the US, there are certain examples of state-level efforts to mandate state public pensions to divest from fossil fuels. And within the net zero frameworks, some of the frameworks have evidence of placing restrictions on fossil fuel investments. So for example, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance says that its members should not invest in new fossil fuel infrastructure projects started after 2021. So we see some examples of limiting fossil fuel investment, but again, there are limitations, and those are subject to voluntary investor compliance with those regulations. And finally, to end, none of the frameworks explicitly discuss future credible pathways for fossil fuel companies. So they might talk about monitoring specific aspects, but not about the specific pathways that fossil fuel companies need to take and how these might be aligned with pension fund fiduciary duties, all of which pose a major oversight for credible investor capacity to influence those companies in line with climate goals. Right, thank you.
Thank you, Clara. So I'll take over with the sector of philanthropy and mainly institutional philanthropy in the global north. The main reason why we include philanthropy in the list of actors is not because they are such a big financial player in terms of global assets or expenditures, but because they have disproportionately large amount of soft power given the size of their capital. For example, when you compare it to pension funds, it's really tens of trillions towards 1.5 trillion. So that's why we're looking into them. And then the problem that you quickly run into is that there's a lot of legal and organizational definitions for philanthropy. And so it is quite hard to grasp it as a sector as a whole. And therefore, it is also unclear, at least as a starting point, what the aggregate global sector is doing, and then specifically on climate mitigation and LFFU. So I started my research categorizing what are the types of philanthropy that we see in this layout. And I won't go in too much detail because we want to get to the governance, but basically this is what the toolkit of philanthropy looks like from my findings. So whether it's grant making, where they hand out grants, so financial aid, whether it's investing, so through endowments or trust funds, where they run into similar dilemmas as the pension funds, or whether it is in more of a political sphere as agents of change, which can either be aligned or misaligned with LFFU itself. And then lastly, more on the tax justice side of things, our philanthropies also used, they are also used as perpetual wealth machines or status quo machines. So the next question I then ask is, okay, if we have this alignment and misalignment of change agents, then what is the sum of those two parts? And then without going into too much detail of what the main outcomes of that were, what is more important is then from a governance perspective, how can the role of aligned agents be strengthened and how can the role of misaligned agents be weakened to progress towards LFFU? So that's what sort of my latest work goes into. So what is then the governance sort of redesign, or what would the actions be to get into that? And this is not a complete overview. These are just a few of the highlights of what that might look like. And some of the initial, let's say, on the inventory side, you can see at the top. So one thing is that there is no clear, again, philanthropic framework because the organizational types are also very diverse. So there's clear fragmentation on both national and regional levels in law and regulation. There are visions from the sector on EU and US levels, but there is no throughput or through-cut vision of how philanthropy should be regulated. So that can be as specific as tax law on what the tax benefits for these organizations are, but also on what types of philanthropy are or are not allowed. Another indication is then is not a critique on philanthropy as a concept, but on this very specific type of philanthropy, which is misalignment through undemocratic, excessive wealth-based power. So that's more a critique on individual wealth accumulation, which is then, which can, for example, be based on fossil fuel, on extractive industries. Think of the big oil barons in the United States. And that is where the critique limits itself to that type of philanthropy. But also, if they would want to align themselves, the research shows that there are limited bureaucratic obstacles to do so. So if they would want to align their grant making or their investment behavior, that would be possible by law. So I'll just give 3 examples of, okay, so what can then be done for philanthropy to remedy these types of, let's say, obstacles or the misalignment. So for alignment, the pressures that I find is that internally, the program officers of foundations can act to go when boards of foundations have less knowledge on the specific subject area that they're active in, that they can pressure them to restructure the activities of the foundations, but maybe more importantly are the external pressures. And one interesting one is that in the US, because in the EU, for example, you have fossil fuel companies have their own foundations. So corporate philanthropy is quite a big thing. Well, in the US, this is a much smaller thing because there's simply regulation that foundations may not hold more than 20% of stock in a company. And that it goes further than the 20%. It also goes into organizational structures that are allowed. If we look at tax, then if you look at the grant making side, for example, then current tax policies especially benefit wealthy donors who want to have tax deduction on the gifts that they give. So the type of democratic participation in philanthropy is also under pressure in that way. So in that sense, some authors have called for tax justice to encourage broader participation in philanthropy. And if they do want to provide public goods, which is also under debate itself, then that can be one way. And lastly, I'll just quickly mention about the grassroots or sort of the advocacy indication, which basically goes into the following, which is that, you know, one of the reasons why comprehensive climate legislation or LFFU legislation has been so difficult for philanthropy to go to is because there's been much more of a focus on very narrow policy goals instead of trying to influence the larger political landscape, which in the end is where more of the leverage lies for LFFU compatible regulation. And that in that sense, you have still the vested interests, which are then kept out of, let's say, the firing range of policy redesign. So these are just a few indications, but I want to leave it at that for now.
Okay, now I would like to turn to multinational oil and gas companies. And what I would like to present today is a brief insight into some preliminary findings of a case study that I'm currently undertaking in South Africa. Next slide, please. So the reasons why I picked South Africa as a case study is firstly because South Africa is still heavily reliant on coal, but there is a growing narrative that oil and gas exploration, both onshore and offshore, but lately particularly offshore, could serve as a transition away from coal. Secondly, in line with that, South Africa launched Operation Fakiza in 2014 as part of its national development plan, aiming to boost economic growth through offshore oil and gas exploration along its coastline. And this initiative has then obviously attracted multinational oil and gas companies to intensify efforts in securing exploration rights in South Africa. And thirdly, South Africa is relevant as it has a very strong and very well-connected civil society, which already in the past has successfully contested resource exploration. And one example is the shale gas exploration in the Karoo, which has been halted due to civil society contestation. And therefore, the central question I explored during my case is, how do multinational oil and gas companies and government justify the need for offshore exploration in South Africa? And how do media and civil society groups frame and contest these initiatives? And how can we learn from these discourses and address to contribute to the goal of equitably leaving fossil fuels underground? Next slide, please. So from expert interviews in the field, as well as a policy analysis, I derived governance challenges and opportunities for the South African case. I listed 10 relevant policies for governing offshore oil and gas exploration in South Africa. I don't have the time to elaborate on them in more detail, but I will directly turn to some governance challenges. Can you press next, please, Frank? Yes. So in 2014, the South African government introduced the One Environmental System, which streamlined the licensing process for oil and gas exploration, but that raised the concern about weakened environmental protections as decision-making shifted from the Department of Environment to the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, and kind of left with the criticism of the fox looking after the hen. And despite the One Environmental System's aim to centralize responsibilities, government departments remain misaligned with conflicting goals regarding the energy transition and fossil fuel phase-out, hindering effective decision-making. Furthermore, exploration permits under the One Environmental System focus on immediate environmental impacts, neglecting future emissions and long-term climate effects of fossil fuel extraction and use. So any scope 3 emissions are not considered in kind of exploration like licensing in South Africa so far. And this thus results in environmental impact assessments in South Africa not adequately addressing climate change and leading to litigation, rather focusing on procedural issues rather than climate impacts of these projects, and revealing the need for better integration of climate considerations in its regulations. Furthermore, the South African government has not, like the definition of what a just transition means in a South African context largely focuses on the protection of co-workers, and only recently through the Presidential Climate Commission has broadened its scope and also looked into environmental and intergenerational justice. And the government's lack of clear direction on energy policy discourages further investment from, on the one hand, renewable energy companies to invest in the sector, but also for oil and gas companies to invest in oil and gas offshore or also onshore in South Africa due to regulatory uncertainty, which increases risks for those companies. And these political uncertainty creates a displacement effect, or what we also know as the waterbed effects, pushing oil and gas companies to move to other countries with either clearer regulations or like a clearer licensing process, weaker climate policy making and weaker civil society organizations. And in the South African region, that is particularly Namibia lately. And there's just a recent case that Total Energies moved out of South Africa and into Namibia, but also Mozambique. And on the opportunity side, I think that's already what I've mentioned. South Africa has a very strong civil society, which in collaboration with environmental groups and local communities has successfully contested oil and gas exploration, also particularly offshore, with key victories like halting Shell's seismic survey at the Wild Coast, and showcases the opportunities for using legal challenges and public mobilization to protect local ecosystems and slow fossil fuel expansion. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Augusto Heras. I'm one of the PhDs within CLIF, and I'm focusing on the role of low and middle income countries in leaving fossil fuels underground. And today I want to briefly pinpoint some issues regarding global energy governance and the potential role of developing countries in it, by starting by acknowledging a structural feature of global energy governance, which is fragmentation. So we don't have a World Energy Organization, but instead a constellation of institutions, actors, but also overlapping governance mechanisms that usually are organized around fossil fuel sector. Regarding instead the development trajectories of developing countries, these have been characterized by energy addition, so adding renewables without displacing fossil fuels, but also fossil fuel expansion and in the end carbon lock-in. And in this, a major role has been played by the deep interdependencies between the state and fossil capital that not only shape the international climate regime, but also affects the ability and the willingness to address fossil fuel supply in the very first place. So next slide, please. Thanks. So to pinpoint some bottlenecks and opportunities across different levels of governance, and here I'm taking the horizontal level by taking the Climate Change Convention and the G20 as nodes for this, but also in terms of vertical governance, so within and across the state and its energy policy, with the state having this nodal role of relaying back and forth across different levels of governance. So in terms of bottlenecks, the Climate Change Convention has been characterized, as we know, by the obstructive role of vested interests, but also commitment gaps, in particularly regarding climate finance, that has fueled distrust between the North and the South, particularly from the South. Regarding the G20, the focus has been more on a fossil fuel based and a geopolitical, I would argue, almost realist geopolitical conception of energy security, while at the vertical level of governance, one obstacle in addressing fossil fuel supply is external debt distress, particularly for middle-income countries in this, and the higher cost of capital that these countries have, and basically impedes them to finance their energy transition. And this has been also an effect of the processes of liberalization and marketization of power generation all over the world, but particularly in global South countries. In terms of opportunity, instead, the Climate Change Convention can be the place where norms around leaving fossil fuels underground can be diffused and normalized through, for example, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, but other supply-side clubs as well. While the G20 can be the place where depth and technology discussion can happen, and in this we need to be creative and find ad hoc instruments which are not silver bullets at all, to, for example, tie the participation to this supply-side climate policy clubs to, for example, debt relief, to make participation in this context more meaningful. In terms of vertical governance, for sure, political commitments for leaving fossil fuels underground from particular countries, specifically producer countries, can be seen as leadership moves that can have spillover effects with other governments, for sure. And for example, here there's Colombia with the endorsement of the Non-Proliferation Treaty for Fossil Fuels, but also other incentives to adopt supply-side climate policies, such as structural change or health benefits. And in this also, there's a potential role for the material and discursive counter-hegemony building within the state around, for example, energy leapfrogging or finding other models of ownership and governance of power generation, including public ownership in this. So to sum up our final brief presentation from all of us, for sure, one common governance challenge is the self-regulation and the voluntary commitments, particularly for financial actors, which are at odds with the time sensitiveness of climate action. But also in terms of, for example, companies, but I would argue also governments, this waterbed effect of companies and governments moving out jurisdiction towards a more favorable one. And for governments can be from the Climate Change Convention to the G20, for example. So having said that, thank you for your attention, and we're looking forward to our panelists' presentations. Thank you.
So if I may take over, you can see that we have actually focused on leaving fossil fuels underground. We have a deliberate reason for doing that, and that is that we do not think, on the one hand, that promoting renewables itself will address the problem. And secondly, we actually see that investment goes in the direction of promoting fossil fuels at the cost of promoting renewables. My second point is that leaving fossil fuel underground is central to achieving the climate change problem, but however, it remains a very, very politically sensitive topic for both governments of the global north and the global south. And we find that the oil companies, coal companies, and other fossil fuel companies are preventing or controlling governments in such a way that action is not happening. My third point is despite all this, we would like to create a sort of interactive atlas that provides you a lot of information about climate change and fossil fuels. And today we are focusing on one aspect of it, conducted by Dr. Yang Chen.
Yes, if you can already see my screen, let me know and I can start my presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yang Chen. I'm a postdoc for the CLIFF project. Here you already see the screenshot of the CLIFFIA, which is an interactive atlas for climate change and fossil fuels. I also send the link in the chat, so you can also explore the website yourself, preferably after my presentation. I have a lot to share with you today, but I will focus on the main content. And let's start with the carbon budget. With carbon budget, we start with historical emissions from around the world. By using the whole data set from Global Carbon Project, we visualize the historical emissions across the world, emissions from each countries and regions in terms of emissions from coal, oil, and gas. And as we call it interactive atlas, the users can scroll and click on corresponding country, for example, United States of America, and then the dialog pops up to show the exact emission from coal, oil, and gas, and the total share of America's emission in terms of global emission. You can do that for each and every emitters on the map. And we also provide conveniently the tree map here, which shows that the top 20 emitters are responsible for more than 80% of the entire global emissions for the entire history between 1750 and 2021. And if we want to have a per capita lens, this is a visualization. As you can see that some resource-rich countries pop out in terms of their per capita emission. These countries are, for example, Qatar, Bahrain, Brunei, Kuwait, Oman, etc. And the reason why we introduce our atlas with the historical emission is to highlight the responsibility that these emitters have in terms of their accumulated emissions, because currently we have a very tight global carbon budget, which is estimated around only 250 gigatons if we want to achieve only with a 50% chance to keep our temperature rise within 1.5 degree. And that value was actually calculated for the year 2023, which means that for now, we only have 5 years of window to act if we want to remain of 1.5 degree as our temperature target. And we further zoom into the emissions since 1990, because that's when our concern grew and climate negotiations started. And if we look back, we can calculate that since 1990 and by 2023, we have depleted almost 80% of the entire 1990 remaining carbon budget, and leaving us a very tight budget for swift and firm emission reduction actions. And specifically, if we zoom into the recent emissions, we can see on this map the emissions from 1990 all the way to 2021, again, per emitter. For example, we can see that the leading country of emissions is China, which emitted for around 208 gigatons of CO2. And you can see the individual sectors from burning coal, oil, and gas. And again, we can visualize the tree map here that China become the leader in, well, the biggest emitter in terms of emissions since 1990, followed by United States and other countries. However, the main trend stays, which is that these top 20 emitters are responsible for, again, more around 80% of the global emissions. And we also compared the relative change of the emitters' contribution to the global emission, and with the red countries being the country whose contribution decreased as we compare the time period between 1990 versus the period after 1990. And the green country are the countries that whose emissions relative contribution to the global emission increased since 1990. And as you can see that this has leave us a very tight carbon budget, and we have to act swift and fast. And then we question the current mechanism in terms of emission reduction. For that, we've direct our users to the World Bank's carbon pricing dashboard. And the World Bank acknowledged that only 1% of the global emissions were properly priced. And then by using a recommended carbon price between 100 to 200 US dollars. But we believe that the carbon tax should be set to the social cost of carbon, which if we account for the economic and climate feedback, which would amount to 3,000 to more than 10,000 US dollars if we want to keep our temperature target within 1.5. With that being said, we conclude that no emission so far has been properly taxed, which is to align with our carbon with our climate target of 1.5 degree, and therefore taxing carbon at the current level is not going to be successful. With that, I'm going to dive into the individual sector of fossil fuels. We start the section with coal. As the UN Secretary General mentioned that phase out of coal is clear climate priority, and to limit warming to 1.5 degree, 90% of the coal must remain unextracted by 2050, and the global volumes of treated coal by 2050 must be reduced by 88%. And now we look at the accumulated emissions from the coal sector alone and its share of the global total between 1990 and 2021. And again, the user can individually explore the emissions from each emitter in terms of how much emission has been emitted from burning coal in that country or region. And then we scrutinize two voluntary mechanisms in terms of phasing out coal. These two mechanisms are PPCA and GCC-PTS. We really question the success meaningfulness of these two mechanisms, because by visualizing, first of all, the membership of these two pledges, as you can see that if I swipe to the right, these are the country's membership to the PCCA. And if I swipe to the left, you see the country's membership to the GCC PTS, which is from COP26. What you can see is that the world is predominantly gray, meaning that most countries are members of neither of these two initiatives in phasing out coal. And as we calculated that it is the country that are members of neither of these pledges who hold the most amount of the trapped coal reserve, having most amount of the coal mine labors, and having the most amount of coal power plant capacities. Therefore, we argue that without the membership of these countries, for example, China, India, Australia, and so on and so forth, these two pledges in terms of phasing out coal is not going to be successful. How did we do that? We visualize again on this dashboard, you see the global tracked coal reserve across the world. And we also highlight the countries with a significant amount of coal reserves being tracked. As you can see, you can also click on an individual country to find more detailed information. For example, for China, the total amount of coal reserve is around 200,000 million tons, according to Global Energy Monitor in the year of 2023. And then China employs around 1 million coal workers in a total of more than 1,000 coal mines. And the total land area of all the coal mines in China is even larger than the entire area of the Netherlands, which is just substantial and shows how challenging it is simply to close down these coal mines and leave these coal reserves underground. And for simplicity, we also have this walkthrough for our readers to have the similar information, which I've just demonstrated. In this case, we show the information for China and India on coal reserves. After showing you the information on coal reserve, we move on to the next part for coal, which is infrastructure. On this interactive map, you see the global coal terminals around the world, with the color being an import or export coal terminal and the size representing their coal terminal capacity. And as you can see, I also visualize a virtual flow of coal from producing country to coal receiving terminals around the world. And as you can see that some countries are major coal exporting countries, such as Australia, Indonesia, South Africa, Russia, and United States, and countries such as China, South Korea, and many Asian countries are the main coal importing countries. And then moving on, we visualize the future possible emissions of burning coal around the world by taking a look at the coal power plant capacities and their remaining lifetime. As you can see, the individual point represents a coal power plant. The redder the power plant, the more time it has remained in terms of the lifetime. And the darker and the lighter it is, the sooner they're going to retire. And as you can see, the light yellow bubble represents the future possible emissions that at the country level that they're going to emit if we do not strand or close down these coal power plants. And as you can see, simply by adding the future possible emissions from China and India, these two countries would actually use all the remaining carbon budgets for the 1.5 degree, which means that we face a lot of challenges in closing down these coal power plants, specifically in Asia, because almost all of the coal power plants in Europe and also in North America are soon going to be closed. And now let's look at the coal power plants financing. If I swipe to the right, you see the countries providing finance to coal power plants. And if I swipe to the left, you see the country's coal power plants receiving financing from home or from abroad. And we provide the statistics as here. The main message is that if a country has a lot of coal power plants with long remaining lifetime, the total amount of co-financing it receives is going to be a lot. So there's high correlation between a country's coal power plants remaining lifetime and capacity and its total received coal finance. And we find this a challenge because it is those countries, the lower and middle income countries, having the most amount of coal power plant capacity and the financing. Therefore, if we do not address this issue, these countries are going to keep running these coal power plants and emit those future emissions and put our temperature target in jeopardy. So with this, I have finished my coal story, and I will continue with the fossil fuel section on oil and gas. And again, we cite that to meet our 1.5 target, we have to keep 60% of the oil and gas remain unrestricted by 2050, and the traded volume of oil and gas by 2050 must be reduced by 60% and 74% respectively, as compared to the 2020 level. And again, similarly to the coal, we also visualize emissions, historical emissions between 1990 and 2021 from burning gas, as well as from burning oil. And then we also visualize a global reserve, for example, of gas on this dashboard. You can see the top country with gas reserve are Russia, Qatar, Turkmenistan, Peru, Mozambique, Iran, Egypt, Indonesia, Australia, and Norway, with the detailed information to be found on the dashboard. We continue to also show the global oil reserve. As you can see, the total tracked oil reserve is more than 3.7 million barrels, so that's 3.7 trillion barrels. And then with countries such as Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, Iraq being the country with the highest amount of tracked oil reserve. And you can also explore the detailed information. And then I move on to show you the gas infrastructure. As you can see, the individual lines represent domestic and international pipelines of gas. And then the countries and regions color is being depicted by showing how many kilometers of gas pipeline there is per million residents. And as you can see, the countries such as Australia, Russia, United States are heavily invested in terms of gas pipelines as infrastructures, meaning that we are really facing challenges in strengthening these assets because we see more gas infrastructure being built in developing countries as well. And then moving on, we also visualize the current emissions from oil and gas fired power plants. And as you can see, this is the current situation. And then we move on to show the future possible emissions from oil and gas fired power plants. Again, you can find the detailed information if you play with the interactive map. Lastly, I will continue to show some statistics on renewables. We consider solar, wind, hydropower, biofuels, and others as key renewables that might act as replacement of fossil fuel energies. And then in doing so, we combined our data from the 6 different types of renewables, again, at the country level. And here on this map, we only visualize the future planned renewables because currently installed renewable energies, we consider them not being able to replace fossil fuels. So if you look at the future planned renewables, you can find we have some hope. For example, China has installed more than 300,000 megawatts of solar power, and you can find the detailed information of the other sectors. And then for all the other countries as well, you can see some countries are entirely relying on solar energy. Some countries are entirely relying on wind energy or having a well-balanced mix. But what does it mean? If I compare the total planned future renewable energy against for example, the coal power plants, That is what you see on this map. The redder the country it is, the more deficit the country has in terms of using future planned renewable to replace a coal power plant capacity. For example, the darkest country on this map is Thailand, having a value of -8. That means that Thailand needs 8 times more than its current future planned renewables to simply replace its current coal power plant's capacity. So that means many countries have a long way to go to speed up their renewable energy installations. So yeah, we have some hope in renewables, but this currently is not as fast as we wanted. That is on the renewable energies. For the section on stranded assets, we're going to provide more calculations in our next launch. For now, if we look at stranded assets purely from the perspective of stranded resource, so leaving fossil fuels on the ground, we can see that there will be more risks in the global south because they are holding the most amount of fossil fuel in terms of coal, gas, and oil in their hands. And I'm not going to stop here because there will be more to show if you explore the interactive assets yourself. We welcome your feedback. We're going to update this atlas frequently and then provide more information timely. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Yang. So now we will move on to Dr. Mathieu Blondel and his presentation.
Hi, am I sharing my screen?
Yes, we see well.
All right. All right. Well, in the interest of time, I'm not gonna talk for too long, and please interrupt me once I'm over 10 minutes or so, because I want to get some feedback as well, and I want some discussion. Because I think the previous conversations were really interesting, and my presentation here today kind of aligns a little bit with some of the stuff that has been said. So without further ado, this work in progress, this paper that I'm presenting here today is called Divest to Decarbonize, Upstream Asset Divestment Among IOCs in the Post-Paris Era. And I'm co-authoring this with 2 colleagues, Mike Bradshaw from Warwick Business School and Yue Guo from the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Just a little bit of background as to why we're interested in this topic. Of course, the oil and gas industry, the global oil and gas industry is, of course, faced with a global energy system transformation, as we call it. And so in the context of this, IOC, so publicly traded oil and gas companies, the likes of Shell and BP and ExxonMobil, etc., they've come up with multiple decarbonization strategies in order to deal with what you could consider an existential risk to their existence. And so they've come up with different types of strategic tools or strategic ways of dealing with this. For example, diversification, investing in renewables, but also reducing carbon intensity and also engaging in carbon offsetting, etc. But one specific, quite controversial yet increasingly popular tool within the industry, or at least that's being propagated within the industry, is this idea of divestment. So the divesting of upstream oil and gas assets, or the full or partial disposal of oil and gas reserves that they have in their portfolios. If you look at, for example, a quote from Shell's strategy report in 2020, they noted that divestments are a key part of our efforts to refresh and upgrade our portfolio as we drive towards our target to become a net zero emissions energy business by 2050 better. So that really means that divesting or selling assets for them is a way of decarbonizing and trying to address climate change. Now, this for us at least raised a number of questions, not in the least the extent to which, okay, so concerns about climate change, to what extent do they actually really drive divestment decisions, not just at Shell, but more broadly at the international oil and gas industry? And so if climate concerns really drives divestment decisions. To what extent do these divestment decisions and these deals that these companies are making actually contribute to decarbonization beyond the decarbonization of the portfolio of company X or Y that is actually selling the oil or gas reserves? So more formally, two questions that we're asking in this paper: to what extent has global energy system transformation, or climate concerns, if you will, driven upstream asset divestments among international oil companies? And second, as a proxy to understand what the implications are of selling oil and gas assets and their implications for climate change, we look at the types of actors that actually acquire these assets. So we're not only interested in the companies that sell it, but also in order to make some claims about the implications in climate terms of the divestment of these assets, we also look at the actors and the types of actors that choose to buy these assets. So in this, or for this, we do a number of things. So first of all, theoretically, we build an interdisciplinary theoretical framework to understand multinational corporations' divestment decisions or decoupling decisions. The reason why we use these two terms, divestment and decoupling, is because we tap into different literatures. The literature in international business, management, and strategy talks about divestment, whereas the economic geography literature, and more specifically GPN literature on global production networks, talks about decoupling. And so this theoretical framework, where we identify a number of more generic drivers of divestment, we apply that to a database that we've designed of 229 global divestment deals by 6 international oil companies in the period past the Paris agreement, of course, and so for the period 2016 to 2023. And we apply that to BP, Shell, TotalEnergies, Equinor, Chevron, and ExxonMobil. Now, very briefly on the theory, I mean, I'm not going to bore you too much with that, although I do think it's interesting. So a number of disciplines do study multinational corporations' divestment and also the drivers behind divestment. But as you know, of course, when you tap into different literatures, you soon find out that these companies have their own, or these companies, well, companies as well, but these literatures have their own vocabularies, their own analytical tools, their own concepts and theories. And as I said, we mostly delve into the literature in international business and economic geography. But I mean, looking at that, we found that there are a number of overarching drivers that we can apply in order to build this more comprehensive theoretical framework. There's firm-specific drivers, there's industry-specific drivers, but also an institutional context that may affect the divestment behavior of multinational corporations across geographic space. And I forgot to include the fourth one, and that is geographic drivers that we've identified as well. And that, or at least the literature in international business and economic geography, basically has a number of gaps that we identify in the paper as well. So especially when it comes to the institutional context, that might be one driver, sure, but that's mostly looking at, okay, what is the institutional context in which our subsidiary, for example, is operating in a specific country, and to what extent does that host country institutional context affect divestment behavior? But actually, if you look at the global energy system transformation, and at a more global level, there is also a global institutional context, you could argue, of course, and that's what we do. So what happens if a global institutional context changes as well? To what extent does this impact these multinational corporations that, of course, are active at a global level as well? And then, of course, the second gap is how effective a strategy is divestment in addressing the underlying challenges that have actually led to the global contextual changes in the first place. And then, as we said, we add a fourth driver to our theoretical framework alongside firm-specific drivers, industry-specific drivers, and institutional drivers. We add a geography-based perspective. So this leads us to what we call a geopolitical economy framework of divestment, where we look at different perspectives, we describe them, we define them, and then also we translate that to, okay, what might be specific drivers for divestment for international oil companies in the context of increased climate action, or what we call global energy system transformation. So a couple of figures and tables to give you a bit of an idea of what we found so far. So as we said, or as I've said, 229 divestment deals identified for the period 2016 to 2023. As you can see cumulatively, you can see that 2018 was a particularly, or the period between 2017 and 2019 was a particularly active period for divestment deals among these 6 oil and gas companies that we identified. Then if you look at the geographies of asset divestment, then you find that most of these deals have taken place in the West, if you will. So most of the assets have been shed in North America and in the North Sea. So in North America, this is likely due to a lot of these companies shedding shale assets in the period of investigation. And of course, the North Sea is because of the aging and depleting reserves in the UK continental shelf, and to a lesser extent also in Norway, where of course Equinor is primarily active. Now, indeed, then looking at, and so from this theoretical framework, we deductively came up with these different codes that we then apply to these different divestment deals, and we look at a number of, if you will, sources in order to determine the drivers. So we look at primary sources like strategy reports, annual reports, press statements, etc. at the time of making a deal, but then also secondary reporting, like journalistic reporting, etc., in order to determine what actually do these companies put forward as the drivers of their divestment deal. And then, of course, we find that there are, at any given deal, it is possible that more drivers play a role than simply one, right? So it can be about portfolio optimization, why you're selling an asset, but at the same time, it can also be framed as, there's transition strategy or transition issues, transition risks that we identify, and life cycle optimization, for example. So there's more drivers that we identify than we have deals. So there's more than 229 drivers. So that I want to highlight as well. Now, just one last thing that I really want to highlight, what might be interesting for this crowd that I'm talking to here today, is then for our second research question, what we find was that, okay, who are these actors that are actually buying these assets, so these oil and gas reserves? And then you find that the vast majority of the buyers are actually independents. So private companies, mostly smaller companies, specialized exploration and production companies, or national oil companies. And so to a far lesser extent, you have oil and gas majors or other international oil companies, the likes of BP and Shell, that actually buy these assets as well. And this actually can or does allow us to make some, well, if we could call it hypotheses as to, okay, what might be the implications of selling these for actually addressing decarbonization concerns and climate concerns in general. So for our first research questions, why do IOCs divest? So the context, of course, matters. There's a variety of issues at play. We find that transition strategy and transition risk is increasingly relevant as a divestment driver. But the question then becomes, how sustainable is this in the coming years? Because, of course, we've seen in the past weeks already, I think it was Shell or BP, I forgot now. I think it was Shell. No, it was BP that completely abandoned its recent transition strategy to reduce its oil production by 2030. So there is indeed a reversal of strategies. So to what extent will transition strategy and transition risk continue to play a role in divestment strategies of oil and gas companies? That's up in the air. And it's clear that firm-based drivers, and this is, in line with what theories in international business, but also in economic geography say, firm-based drivers remain dominant. If you think about, for example, why, couldn't talk too much about that, but why, for example, Shell in the period 2016 to 2018 was actually divesting to such a large extent, is because they had just acquired BG Group before that, and they were engaging in a 30 billion multi-year divestment program. So it didn't have anything to do with an institutional context or a geography-based drivers or transition strategies whatsoever. It was purely firm-based drivers. Now, for our second research questions, of course, as I said, it's mostly independents and national oil companies like Saudi Aramco, Qatar Energy, etc., that basically buy these assets. They receive much less public scrutiny, of course, and so they are also subject to completely different drivers as to why they're actually active in the oil and gas industry. And so this is really a concern and I've talked to a lot of climate campaigners over the years as well, that say, well, how do we deal with these companies? Because Shell and BP, etc., they're publicly traded, Western-based or Western-headquartered oil and gas companies that you can relatively easily campaign against. But how do you campaign against the NOCs or the private independents that are actually much bigger owners of the reserves and much bigger producers if you calculate it all together? And so as divestment becomes part of IOC transition strategies, the risk of transferred emissions increases as well. And transferred emissions is basically the concept that you're transferring emissions from one company to another because no company buys these assets to leave them in the ground, right? And so assets may switch, and this is kind of speaking to the economic geography literature on global production networks. So this asset ownership may go to alternative network geographies that expose them to different power dynamics and logics of value capture. So yeah, transition strategy is something that is becoming increasingly important as a driver for divestment, and that has to do indeed with this changing context of the global energy system transformation. But to what extent does this have positive effects for overall decarbonization? Possibly no positive effects or even negative effects, because also the companies in whose hands these assets end up with have even worse environmental track records than the Shells and BPs of this world. And as I said, these oil and gas reserves are simply not left in the ground. So that means that divestment is not a viable decarbonization strategy. And I believe that more interventionist government-led supply-side climate policies are crucial to leaving fossil fuels in the ground altogether. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Matthew. If it's okay, I think we will go to Shiming's presentation and then have a few minutes at the end for questions.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute and let me share my slides. Yeah. Can everyone see my slides? Thank you. Oops. So thank you for having me here in this panel, and my research, which is a co-authored project with my colleague Wang Jue and Michael Sampson from Leiden. I think we're talking less about the fossil fuels, so it's probably a little less closely related to other presentations in this panel. But we are having a still really work in progress research that looks like maybe climate clubs, maybe not. We're still trying to define this kind of climate finance organizations that we are studying. And we have a little bit of a preliminary results, but the most part of it, which we will conduct in interviews, we have done a few, but a lot more to go. And we welcome any types of questions and comments for our research. So first, some of the big pictures. So we all know that currently there is insufficient north to south climate finance, especially from the public sector. The 100 million goal hasn't been reached yet. I mean, depending on the source you're looking at. And now there is a new additional quantifying goals that is still being negotiated. But any types of measure will agree that the demand for climate finance in the global south hasn't been met. And in the same time, we see there is a diversifying climate finance actors and the mechanisms, and there is a big spaghetti bowl of donors and recipients, and a lot of intermediaries. And here we just cite one of the many graphs that show this really complicated structure. And a few of the major organizations are national governments and philanthropies. So some of the presentations in this panel already addressed a few of them. And many categorizations in current literatures out there look at multilateral developmental banks, such as the World Bank, other regional MDBs. And then we have bilateral developmental aid agencies, such as USAID, UKAID, as well as some of the ministries in certain governments. So they are also a major sources. They sometimes fund projects independently. Other times they fund multilateral climate funds or MDBs and so they fund each other a lot. And then we have the multilateral climate funds, such as GCF and a host of other related funds under UNFCCC and UNEP, as showed in the previous picture. Philanthropies and corporations, they are increasingly entering the major previously dominated by public donors landscape. And they have co-founded increasingly more projects with the public funders. So here in this project, we want to look at that what we think is a new type of climate finance organizations that they feature. So from a glimpse, they look like minilateral organizations. So they have multiple countries as members to these organizations, but much less than what we would have at UNFCCC funds. So many of them started with 10 or 20 countries. And usually we have half of them are developed countries, the other half are developing countries, depending on the organizations, but they are much smaller in size. Second, they have usually more specific climate goals than UNFCCC fund or World Bank that has humongous amounts of money, but also all-encompassing types of climate issues. So some of them focus more on energy, others focus more on short-lived climate pollutants, etc. But usually they have they don't usually fund mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, everything. And we also see that they have a mixed donors structure. So we see state donors, we see MDB donors sometimes, and we see philanthropy donors. So they are quite open to different types of contributions. But I don't think any of them, they receive private contributions. And another feature is that they also have a mixed member governance. So some of them are featured state assembly combined with UN bureaucrats. Others of them has a more professional kind of governance that have a leadership from more, I would say, consultancy and or auditing organizations, but they are not from the public sector. Last but not least, they tend to have a greater transparency and less bureaucracy than most multilateral organizations. So usually they produce annual reports with more numbers and have a stronger accountability mechanisms, usually in terms of external auditing. So these are just a few features that we find in a few organizations, and we want to see if they are indeed types of new organizations. And if they are, so what is why are they come into being, and what would their potential impact be? So in this project, we look at 3 organizations. The first, and so each of us are responsible for one organizations. I am in charge of the CCAC Climate and Clean Air Coalition. Part of that comes from my dissertation research. All of the three organizations, they were established around 2011, 2012. And all of them started with a similar size of countries, like 10 or 20, but some of them have grown significantly over 10 years. Others grown less much. All of them have also gone through some sort of institutional reforms over these 10 years. They are also quite similar in size. Three of them, they have roughly 100 million US dollars as their the funding available for them. So not too big, but also big enough to study them. All of them have a, judging from name, they have a relatively more specific focus than general climate change. They also have different types of governance, operational models, and the scope of projects they are interested in that we're currently still studying. So we have mapped their their sponsors, and we can see that for CCAC, for example, most of its sponsors are state agencies from US, Canada, Norway. So a few of the major developed countries out there, and increasingly Global Mason Hub, which is by itself also a kind of a mixed donor. So it has Global Mason Hub focused on Mason. It gets money from public and private sources, which is not the topic of our research. But so we can see that, and this CCAC has also gone through some radical changes after the first 10 years. So we are looking into that as well. So the mini metro organizations started with like 20 something, now has grown into organizations with nearly 100 state members. And they work a lot also with other NGOs and IOs. Sustainable Energy for All, the other organization, this organization is headquarters in Vienna, whereas the CCAC was headquartered in the UNEP headquarters in Paris. So Sustainable Energy for All takes a quite different governance structure that we're currently still looking into, but we can already see that their funding structure is really different. It has a lot of NGO fundings, philanthropies, as well as bilateral and multilateral public agencies funding it. And it used a different governance model as well. But it also has a strong, it also originated from a UN organization, just as CCAC still now. But I think currently it's not hosted in UN anymore, unlike CCAC. Global Green Growth Institute also has a really diverse funding structure, and as you see the colors, and they also get even more diverse contributors. And this one we haven't really looking into their governance models because they are located in Seoul, and we're trying to do the field work by the end of the year. But we expected to also take a different operation model, because currently we have interviewed a few people who have worked at 2 or 3 of these organizations. Apparently there is a lot of internal personnel exchanges between them, and they already tell us there are many similarities as well as differences. So looking at these 3 organizations, we are trying to formulate some of the research questions that we can answer. Our biggest interest is, or biggest curiosity is that why would the states, international organizations, and fiercely want to fund these organizations? Are they just another climate finance organizations out there? Or do they actually contribute or innovate in terms of substantive function, or in terms of control of the sponsors, controls by the sponsors, which goes back to the principal agency dynamics? Or is it there is some the IO dynamics in this, that some of the institutions, they are they want to gain more independence, that just keep growing? We don't know this yet. Because currently, in terms of themes, some of the themes are quite innovative that hasn't been really covered by UNFCCC. Others are just existing themes such as energy and green growth. And based on the field research that we have already done, that we have definitely already seen that the control from the state donors definitely play some roles. The attributes of the institutions, such as how responsive, how partner-based they are, and how the projects are based on science, and all those factors also play into the state donors' preferences. But again, this can differ between the three organizations. So we don't know that yet. A second question that we want to answer is that, are these multilateral organizations, are they climate clubs? Do they want to be climate clubs? If they are, what kind of club goods are they offering? Currently, there are literatures showing that they can be climate clubs, such as CCAC. But as we're talking about climate change, it's really hard to just offer extremely exclusive club goods. If you are producing knowledge, usually they are more or less public goods. But we have seen that they can be club goods, as usually the member states, they have access to some financial resources that non-members are not. And last but not least, we are interested in what is their role in international climate finance, because fundamentally this goes back to the climate justice issues. So because we know that developed countries, they're probably more interested in the mitigations, and they care more about accountabilities, whereas developing countries, they increasingly they are more interested in adaptation and loss and damage, and they want more independence or more say in how they want the money to be distributed. And we see this kind of fight plenty enough at UNFCCC and bigger multilateral forums. So is this a way that donors take back control or not? And that will that influence the distribution of funds across different climate projects or different climate categories of climate issues? We don't know that yet. And also in terms of efficiency, is this more efficient or a more effective way of addressing certain aspects of climate change? This is also what we're interested in, but we're still working on it. And as you see that this is still much in the making, and we welcome any types of comments. Thank you very much. I hope I don't go over time too much.
No, you're perfect on time. So I think we have a few minutes left for questions, and I think if we go a little bit over 4 o'clock, unless people have to leave, that's also okay. So for the attendees, you can put your questions into the Q&A chat, and we can see them there. Otherwise, I think you can raise your hand and we will be able to unmute you if you would like to go ahead and ask your question directly. But we have a few.
There are also questions in the webinar chat.
Yes, exactly. I was just going to start that already. So based on the questions in the panelist chat, I think first for Matthew Drayton, you had a couple questions. I'll just summarize those if that's okay.
Maybe he answered some of the questions, so maybe I'll just take the question that's left over in my mind. I'm still trying to figure out, why do independents purchase these divested shares? Is it because they think they can make a short-term killing? So in which case one guesses that these independents don't have any interest in climate change.
Well, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is it's also interesting to look at where these independents are actually buying these assets. And so for the period that we investigated it, it's primarily in Northern America, and then specifically in the shale areas. So basically, these independents are highly specialized companies, mostly private companies, that are very much specialized in this specific extractive technique of horizontal drilling
But Matthew, you also had in your maps in the global south, you also had areas where there was divestment. And I was
Yes.
curious about who's buying it in the global south.
Yeah, well, if you look at, for example, what happened, just to give you a country case example, Nigeria, famous case of course, Shell leaving all the offshore assets there, shedding its offshore assets. It's basically national companies, National Nigeria. I forgot the name of the exact national
So they're
NOC
buying it
in
off.
Nigeria. Yeah, that is actually buying up these assets, and actually also in a consortium with the help of a number of smaller companies there as well. So that's
So
interesting.
this will also have an impact on Yang's assessment of how much fossil fuels are in the developing world and maybe in the hands of developing country people.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop there.
Yeah.
I just had a question for Shiming, and that is how much of your money is for loans and how much is it for grants?
Thank you, Joita. I think the vast majority of that is actually grants. And maybe if I can ask, I also have a kind of a question out of personal curiosity about carbon tax, because I think that's a really important point. But I wonder, is there already like a lot of research about carbon tax and what should be a good criteria to make the tax? Because we're talking about, climate justice, like what is the real social cost? Are you talking about like a Dutch tax is a social cost for the Netherlands? Then I think the price would be relatively low compared to a carbon tax levied on Bangladesh, because they are a lot more vulnerable to it. So every 1 gram of carbon should be more expensive. But I don't know if that makes sense to everybody, but it's just like a one personal thoughts when I heard it.
I don't know what Yang will say, but I think the social cost of carbon is sort of an average global number. And it's not very clear as to who pays this money. So in Yang's presentation was more general that it would be charged on everybody, but I don't think you can charge it on the developing countries or on people who are in survival mode, but that is for Yang to answer.
Yeah, indeed, the carbon tax that I presented, first of all, the data was from the World Bank. That was simply showing how much each country is charging on carbon tax. And as you can see that most of them were below the recommended level, which was based on the World Bank, that they believe that is the fair price to be priced. But we argue that that price was so low that it does not take into account the actual social costs of carbon, which for the 1.5 degree would be so high. And that just simply indicate even the average extra ton of carbon is so high, more than 3,000 US dollar per ton, that simply is not manageable in its current implementation. So yeah, that's our argument. So we don't have the detailed answer per country how much should be charged. But indeed, in some simulation models, they play with assumptions and vary the tax at the country level if you put a temperature target in that model. But we don't have the details to share for now. Yeah.
I totally agree with you, because the reason I'm asking this is originally I was thinking, okay, tax, the government levy it and use it domestically, but now we're talking about a carbon tax. It should be destined to for transnational transfer, so which I think that creates a lot more challenges.
Yang, there's a question in the chat for you, asking if you could say something about the main data sources that you use to build the atlases and how current that data is.
So, for example, all of my emissions data is from the initiative called Global Carbon Project. The data is from 1750 till 2021. So the most recent 2 years data is missing simply because they haven't finished calculating or attributing the emissions to each of the countries. But if you use other data sources, they already have the newest data, but slightly different. So you would miss a detail such as emissions from each individual fossil fuel type. So that's why I chose a global carbon project. And for my data on fossil fuel sectors concerning coal, oil, and gas, quite some data actually is from the Global Energy Monitor. It's an open platform where you can download the data if you fill out the information, and I process the data and then presented the data in the format as you saw earlier. And then there are some other extra data from various sources, IEA, or from government websites. And then I provide actually the references on the Interactive Atlas if I used those data sources. But these two would be my main data source providers. And yeah, if we're talking about individual story maps, and then there might be a different data source.
And we have a question from Frank, but I'll let him say it out loud.
Yeah, thanks. I had a question for you, Shiming, about if you are looking into, or if you have any idea on in what way the funders are involved in the mission and organization of these clubs. Because I think, at least from what I read, usually the philanthropists are quite involved in then what the mission of certain projects or networks that they are part of are. So I was just curious.
Thank you, Frank. And also, I had to adjust my answer to Joita previously because I'm mostly focused on CCAC. So a lot of answer is based on CCAC. I haven't met with my colleagues about their fieldworks about the other organizations. So it can be a little bit different. But you're right. And so CCAC also does not involve a lot of philanthropies yet. It's majorly funded by governmental organizations. I think they are a lot more involved in GGGI and SE4O. But I think in general, a lot of them are engaged in terms of co-founding, which is also the case for CCAC. So they single funded much less and less, but they just usually cooperated with like local partners in the whatever countries they have projects in. So I think they are probably more engaged in the projects than, but I don't have a great answer for that yet. But we can keep you updated when we find the answer.
Yep. So unless there are any further questions that panelists or attendees would like to ask, if there are, then please jump in now. Otherwise, I think we will say thank you very much to everyone for attending and to the panelists for your great presentations. We really enjoyed them all, so thank you. I'll give 1 second for anyone to jump in with another question. Okay. If not, then thank you so much to everybody, and hope to see you in another event at ESG.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.